Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our regular scheduled Brown Bag Lecture Series here at the Kearney Public Library. We're very excited for today's talk. I want to thank you all. I see many regular attendees. And if this is your first time, welcome. We do these events the second Tuesday of every month in partnership with the Kearney Public Library. They're wonderful partners. It's a wonderful community space. Really one of the cultural treasures of the Kearney community. If you want more information on the history department or any of the other activities that we do, we have information on the history department at the back table with upcoming talks, other events. Our next Brown Bag Lecture Series is going to be on April 9th over the noon hour, and it's going to be Dr. William Stoudemire from the history department talking about the life and times of Harry Indian Miller, who's a, what's a good way of describing Harry? He's a pretend archaeologist who loots a lot of things out of the American Southwest and makes a lot of wild claims and does a lot of interesting things that Dr. Stoudemire will take us through. Now, importantly though, today, our title is the Road to Title IX, and our speaker is Lina Homberger Cordia. She earned her PhD in history from the University of Nebraska at Lincoln, and her book project, which she is hard at work on in her abundant spare time, we all know Lina is one of the hardest working historians in the community, is titled Las Aztecas, Gender Nationalism and Sport in Mexico and the World in the Early 1970s, where she examines women's entry into soccer, traditionally a man's sport, in the early 1970s, especially using media treatments of female athletes. She is currently the Community Engagement Director at the Buffalo County Historical Society and Trails and Rails Museum. But now, let's welcome Lina.
Okay, can everybody hear me okay? Great, thank you. Welcome. I'm so glad everybody came out on this nice Wednesday day. I know I might rather be outside, so I really appreciate it. So why are we having this talk in March? March is Women's History Month, and it's a great way to recognize women's accomplishments throughout the world. But as a little bit more than half of the world's population, I would argue that we should not limit our celebration of women's achievements to 1 month of the year. That might just be a personal opinion. But I do look forward today to talking about a lot of different topics. What we're going to do is we're not going to go through a statistical analysis of Title IX, so be happy that that's not what we're doing. We're going to use a lot of different examples, and not just from the United States, to really look at the global ramifications of such a massive piece of legislation as Title IX, as well as looking at what has changed in the United States. So I look forward to hearing your questions. I'm happy to expand on or clarify anything that we touch on today while we're talking. So first of all, I wanted to talk about something you may all have read about or talked about or perhaps even been at in 2023, which was the world record-setting Nebraska Husker volleyball game in Husker Stadium. More than 90,000 people attended, except this was not a world record. And so at the time, I was finishing my dissertation. I was a student at UNL, and my phone started blowing up with all of these messages. Have you seen this? Wow, I know you do sports. This is so cool. And I thought, wow, that is really cool. But what I was currently studying was what you see on the other side of the screen here. That is the 1971 Women's World Cup Championship in Mexico City, where more than 110,000 people came and attended. 92,003 fans is amazing. It is incredibly remarkable, and I am so happy that it happened in Nebraska, because it's something now that the rest of the world was able to put eyes on us and think about. But if you look closely at all of those news articles now from places like NBC, CNN, ESPN, that said things like Nebraska volleyball sets world record at the bottom, they now mostly have little addendums that say, correction, the real world record was in 1971. And so for us, this was pre-Title IX in 71, and it was outside of the United States. So what does this suggest about women and girls' participation in sport around the globe? It really makes us consider, is the United States really a leader in sport equity? So, why should we care about sports? Linda, this will be a repeat for you, sorry about that.
No.
She saw me talk about something very similar yesterday. So sports, even if you don't play sports or you didn't, even if you are not that interested in watching sports, sports are a great many things, and they're almost impossible to divorce from many other elements of our lives. So, for example, sports are political, right? Who's familiar with the 1968 Olympics in Mexico City with the Black Power salute, right? Tommy Smith and John Carlos. That stands out today as an iconic memory, an iconic piece of the 68 Olympics. And it had nothing to do with the actual sport, right? That was a protest. Sports can be controversial. Today, we have the ongoing debates over trans athletes in sports. That really is a debate over the differences between sex and gender, which there are clear differences between the two. Sex is biological, male, female. Gender is a socially constructed way to conceive of how we identify ourselves. And so that's really what the core of that debate is. But sports is the realm where most of this debate occurs, because sports tend to be competitions based on a lot of biological characteristics of the athletes. Sports, on the other hand, can unite us. If you've ever attended a sports match or a professional game, you don't know the people sitting around you, right? But you're all cheering for the same team. You're often wearing the same shirts, scarves, memorabilia. They become your family for that time being. When your team wins, everybody hugs each other, they cheer, they celebrate. When your team loses, you commiserate together. Or if you have bad sportsmanship, you might boo together the other team. Sports also represent national identities. So when athletes go compete in the World Cup or in the Olympics, they are their country for all intents and purposes. They have strict rules that they are supposed to abide by when they are, not only competing, but talking to the media, going on little excursions around wherever their competition is based. So we can really do a lot of analysis when it comes to mega sporting events and international events about what it means to be an American, what it means to be someone of a specific nation. They also forge transnational connections. How many of you pay attention to professional sports where many of the athletes are not American, right? This has been true for more than 50 years, where some of the best athletes in their sport go to wherever the competitions are. And this is even more true for female athletes. For instance, there were very thriving professional soccer leagues in Italy for women in the early 1970s. And so athletes from the United States, from Latin America, from other European countries went there. And they played professionally, they got to know others, they created their own new communities with these transnational connections in that way. They also build community in many ways. If you have children, grandchildren, sisters, nieces, cousins, and you've ever attended their basketball game, their soccer match, their wrestling match, these are all very familiar to you, this sense of community. You all root for the same team, whereas if you didn't know someone on that team, you probably wouldn't be sporting a Kearney High School sweatshirt or an elementary school badge, right? They're also very profitable. Sports is a multi-billion-dollar industry, and that impacts a lot of the ways that people can or want to access sports. They also prompt us to push the limits of human endurance and what we are physically able to do. So there's a scientific piece to sports, and there is a lot of research that goes into what humans can and cannot do. We like to set world records. We're very interested in keeping track of them. For instance, the current world record for 1 mile is 3 minutes 43:13. That's pretty fast. And people continue to try to pare that down. And so whereas when we first started keeping records for things, when you beat the record, it was sometimes by hours, depending on the sport, or minutes. Now we're looking at tiny fractions of seconds as we reach the ultimate limits of what the human body can achieve. But finally, sports are fun. We like sports. We like to be entertained. Many of us like to play informally, even catch, recreational type things where you go out and about and you enjoy sporting activity. So as we move forward, kind of think about what your experience with sports is. Do you watch the Super Bowl, for instance? Or do you just watch it for the commercials? Or do you turn off the TV for the whole day? We all have different relationships with sports. Have you ever been to a professional game? Do you ever play sports in the park? All of these things are important, but as we move into talking about Title IX, think about your experience with PE in school. What did PE look like for you? For many of us in this room, PE probably looked very different depending on which side of Title IX you lay on. So what is Title IX? It was signed into law in June 1972, and it is one part of the educational amendments of 1972. So that's important to keep in mind that Title IX is not just about sports. And it was never intended as a sports law, but that's really what we think of it as today. It prohibited discrimination in any educational activity, but the impact on women and girls in athletics was phenomenal. And that was by Betty Morris of UC Berkeley, who studies the impacts of Title IX. For example, in 1972, 99% of athletic budgets in the United States went to boys and men's sports. So it was almost a wash. So you can kind of see why we associate Title IX with sports. Almost immediately, many athletic departments fought the changes that Title IX was going to bring. Tooth and nail, they did everything they could to avoid having to abide by this law. This affected K-12 schools as much as it did colleges and universities. So this applies to every educational institution that receives federal funding. So it is a very broad law. And even its implementation was fraught. Between 1972 and May 1975, when Gerald Ford signed the final version of Title IX into law, senators continued to debate the athletic pieces of the law and introduce amendments that often died in committee, largely to exclude profit-making sports, which mainly meant football, from compliance with the law. But that didn't end it. In 1976, the National Collegiate Athletic Association, the NCAA, who will keep coming up today, they filed a lawsuit challenging the legality of Title IX, and the suit was dismissed 2 years later in 1978. Its full implementation also did not occur in 1972. High school athletic programs had until July 21st, 1978 to comply, so just before the 1979 school year. So this is an extended implementation process, and it continued to face lawsuits, competing judicial interpretations. So when you hear people talk about Title IX today and you assume that it sounds like settled law, just remember that this is a very fluid, a very alive piece of legislation facing continued challenges and reinterpretations, essentially every couple of years since it was passed. The most recent was a sweeping change to Title IX in 2021 that addressed discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity, which clarified protections provided under Title IX in that area. It's also important to keep in mind what Title IX is not. It does not apply to intramural, informal, or other sports kind of at the bottom of the organizational level, and it also does not apply to the highest echelons of sporting activity, professional sports. That being said, you might argue that it nonetheless impacts, it really plays an important part in these areas as well. Many athletes who go on to professional careers only are able to do so because of the access granted to them at those lower levels. So, with that in mind, let's take a look at some examples of the before period, the dark ages before Title IX. Not really. Actually, you're gonna see that it's pretty vibrant before. So, before Title IX, girls' and women's participation varied widely by activity, by region. You'll see just a selection of photos here, and I'll talk a little bit about each of them. But generally, before this was really codified in law, women's sports tended to be framed as recreational and as non-competitive, or otherwise for benefiting physical fitness, but not so much to compete athletically. So, I've talked to a number of women about their experiences, women with different ages, different regions of the country, and one that stands out to me is actually my mom, who has really framed a lot of my understanding of Title IX over the years as she helped kind of, well, my tough and very, very obstinate self come of age. But I was talking to her at one point in time about her relationship with Title IX because she graduated high school in 1975. And she said, when I was growing up, girls weren't put into sports. We didn't gain the skills, the knowledge, the muscle memory. For me, by the time I was in junior high, I went out for track because I was interested in athletics, but there were already superstars. She says she remembers the coach looking at her like, well, you're not a natural born athlete, so you're not good enough. So she went into cheerleading. That was an easy move for her. It was something that she was always led to believe was appropriate for girls, and it was open. And she liked being a cheerleader because she said she was always the head cheerleader. So she learned leadership skills, she learned money management skills. But she said for many of her friends, Title IX did open up their options, some of them who had that natural talent. They went out for basketball, they played a number of different team sports. But she concludes saying, for those of us that would have needed training and a little mentorship, it just wasn't open. If you didn't grow up with a father, a mother, or a brother who was interested in that, then you just didn't have a chance. And so that's kind of the attitude is, if you lucked into having someone who was willing to foster that interest or those skills early on, there were many opportunities for girls to play, either in co-ed situations, to, if they were wealthy, to hire coaches to train them to compete in some of the more exclusive sports like golf or tennis. But there were a lack of opportunities across the board for many girls and women. I talked to some women yesterday, there were no school programs that offered sports for them in their experiences. Some did, but they often had different rules for girls. For instance, in basketball, a lot of the time in the pre-Title IX period, they might have played with 6 players versus 5. They might have been limited to half-court basketball versus full-court basketball. Some girls had to play basketball without being able to run the ball forward. They could only pass it to move it down the court. So that looks very different from what we think of when we think of basketball today, right? So it was very sporadic, very inconsistent. But what I do want to look at are some of the women who persevered despite this lack of access. What you see up in the top right there with the K's, that's Kearney High School 1915 basketball team. In what I've done at the archives at the Buffalo County Historical Society, I have found some remarkable evidence of girls in the high school playing all sorts of sports in the teens and in the 20s. They had a baseball team, if you believe that. Not softball, but baseball. They also had, basketball pretty much the whole way through. They had wrist wrestling, which apparently was very popular in the teens. It's just arm wrestling. Boys and girls could play. So they found many opportunities to participate in Kearney. But again, that was not necessarily true in some of the more rural areas. Down at the bottom there, you'll see a famous photograph that many of you might recognize. That is Catherine Switzer being nearly bodily removed from the 1967 Boston Marathon. So, if I can show you here. This is her. She's running in sweats because she's trying to hide her chest. This is her boyfriend trying to pull this gentleman off of her, who is grabbing her sweatshirt and yanking her backwards, because it was illegal for women to compete in the Boston Marathon. They banned women outright at this time, so she registered under, I believe it was her brother's name, and was running the race trying to hide her identity. And she finished it. She was fine. There were no major implications. She's gone on to write books and do a lot of speaking publicly about her experience in this.
What year did you say?
67. So this is kind of on the cusp, but still pre-Title IX. The year following that, in 1968, is when the Olympics introduced sex testing, which only applied to women. They were trying to suss out men that were masquerading as women. None were ever found. This was a highly controversial thing that the International Olympic Committee did. But of course, they never tested any men who they suspected of being women, because they just assumed that women could never make it to the Olympics competing against other men. They're just simply not good enough. But if a man who's mediocre in sports just masquerades as a woman, then he might get one over on the Olympics and win a medal. So there's some clear sexism in the creation of these sex tests that were, after a few years, again, banned, but there was a lot of controversy there. A great example is boxing, because boxing tends to be a very masculine sport. It's very physical, it's very violent, and even for men, it's always been a fairly controversial sport. But this lady here with the female Ali across her shirt is Jackie Tonawanda, who she challenged some of the legal barriers to women participating in sports, right again on the cusp of Title IX being accepted. In 1979, she had to sue the New York State Athletic Commission for denying her a boxing license because of her sex. So she went on to become a heavyweight boxer. She won her challenge in the New York State Supreme Court, and she participated in heavyweight boxing throughout the 70s and the 80s. Outside of the United States, there were similar things going on when it came to women participating in sports. If they push the boundaries too far, we often see various reasons provided for why women are going to then be curtailed from participating. In Brazil, under the Getulio Vargas regime, they banned women from playing the national sport, which was soccer, at a time when women's soccer had been expanding rapidly, right? It was becoming very public, and the leagues were incredibly popular. So the reasoning behind the ban in the Brazilian case had to do with the growth and popularity of the sport, coupled with concern over its impact on young women by public health experts, because it might damage their reproductive systems if they ran too hard, if they got hit with a ball. And so there was a lot of pseudo-medical reasoning employed at the time to deny women access. There were other organizational bans. In England, for instance, keeping soccer in mind, the Football Association created a ban of women from using any of their fields or from playing soccer from 1921 to 1971. Again, because women had been organizing and being successful, they'd been playing soccer, usually in the World War II era for fundraising, to earn money for veterans' homes, for sending money to the home front, for supporting veterans after the war. And there was also a very famous team called the Corinthians who barnstormed across Europe into Latin America, even into the United States in the 20s. They played in Texas against men's teams because there weren't many women's teams at the time. So the ban in this case in England was because of that monetary piece. They thought that women playing soccer for money cheapened the sport, and so they shouldn't do that. But I think the most interesting example I have here is this woman on the top left. You can kind of see she's holding a sword. Any guesses on what sport she pushed her way into?
She's a matador.
She is a matadora, yes. So she is North America's first female bullfighter, at least the first that I've been able to find. So this lady was born November 18th, 1930 in St. Louis, Missouri, and at 7, she saw her first bullfight in Mexico with her parents on vacation. According to Jean Flynn, who wrote this Texas Women Who Dared to Be First, she saw the movements of the man and the bull as a beautiful dance. So keep that in mind. She saw the aesthetic appeal of the bullfight. Her parents, however, disapproved. They thought bullfighting was barbaric, violent, and cruel, which it may very well be. But that's not what she saw. So in 1948, she enrolled at the University of Texas at Austin, studying music and drama, and then she switched to art. So to her, bullfighting incorporated music, drama, and art all in one. They were all complementary. So in 1950, her grades weren't so great at Austin. She transferred to El Paso, and the benefit was that she could pop over into Ciudad Juarez and see bullfights all the time. So she had continued her entire life from 7 years old with this dream that she would someday become a bullfighter. But this focus on aesthetic appeal is important. She saw the fluid movements of the bullfight. She saw the beauty like a ballet or like some other intricate dance in what the matadors were doing to tease and to lead the bull during the fight. Of course, not all observers agreed, and it was particularly troubling to her parents that she wouldn't give up this dream of hers. But she went on to remarkable success. She persevered, and in 1956, Sports Illustrated covered her mano-a-mano match between her and Betty Ford, another American bullfighter. So definitely on the margins of women's sport at the time. By 1956, McCormick had already bested more than 100 bulls and she had suffered a goring and recovered and gone back to it. Betty Ford had 53 bulls under her belt, so this was a test to see which is the best female bullfighter. The article, which was by Rafael Delgado Lozano, was titled Travesty in Tijuana. So a lot of what I do is look at the media representations of female athletes, and this one was a doozy. He described it as disgusting and disgraceful, revolting, a nauseating exhibition, and a disaster. Both of these matadoras were American, so I'm not even going to go into the implications there to talk about their nationality. But he described McCormick as a small but determined former art student from Big Springs, Texas, so fairly neutral. But when we get to Ford, things change a little bit. She was a slim and pretty one-time model from McKeesport, Pennsylvania. Not quite so neutral. And unfortunately, her performance in the bullfight this time was very poor, so then she also became a, quote, panicky actress. So you see, the way that media interpreted women in the pre-Title IX era in sport was often by first focusing on their physical features, by either overtly sexualizing or questioning the femininity of women, or in combination, oftentimes, really just demeaning their abilities and making it into a spectacle in every sense of the word. This bullfight turned into a comedy of errors. McCormick's team gave a bunch of the bulls laxatives to weaken them before the fight, so they were a mess. They were disheveled and disoriented, and neither of these bullfighters performed particularly well. It seems like they both really realized how much pressure was on them, and they both kind of failed to put on that intricate aesthetic performance. They really struggled to actually take the bulls down in the way that is expected. So it kind of turned into a mess, and a couple times they had to have the picadors come in and help them with the bulls. So unfortunately, Delgado Lozano was kind of right in that it was a spectacle, and it was kind of disgusting and disappointing in the end, but not because there were women competing. It was more the behavior of some of the organization. But the way he describes the bullfighting compared to McCormick is pretty interesting. He says it's an art form, just like her, ancient and stylized, but he insists that it defied female intrusion. So he went into this as a reporter with the expectation that they should fail at this endeavor because they don't belong here. He said women are somehow they're not made to mold themselves in plastic grace with a bull, but they're good at ballet, right? So there's a little bit of a disparity there. But he's determined that when the bull charges, most women will lose their sense of serenity because this ultimately is a virile sport where men can prove their honor and their masculinity. So, an interesting example. So here, let's see if I can find the mouse. Just to show some of you, because I know many of you may never have seen a bullfight. This is preserved by the Library of Congress, and this is a bullfight in 1898 in Seville. So if you kind of look, you can see what McCormick was so interested in. The costumes, the procedure, the way that the bullfighter is teasing the bull and trying to kind of elongate this standoff. She saw the bravery in keeping your composure when you have this, one-ton animal coming at you, and standing him down to avoid his charge. Writing a little bit earlier, Bill Beasley, who is a historian of Mexico, was writing in about this era when this film was taken, because these two women were not the first matadoras, of course. His assumption is that the possibility of women moving out of the home into greater public visibility is what was provoking satirical comment, that females, God forbid, might enter male occupations. So he found a cartoon where in the 1890s, a female matadora appeared in the news, and so this cartoon describes her activities of the day of the bullfight. First, the matadora sews children's clothing, went to market, dressed for the bullfight, fought her 3 bulls, was hurt by the last one, but managed to recover, And then in the last two panels, dragged the bull home and made bull meat tamales. So from 1890 to 1956, we're seeing a very similar reaction to women entering this particularly masculine spectator sport. And I didn't even have to touch about the controversy of animal rights, and that's beyond the scope today. So that kind of takes us into the transitional era. So we can kind of imagine the before Title IX period. It's incredibly sporadic. Really, if you look for it, you do see really interesting examples of women doing all sorts of sporting activities. But as a general rule, there was no requirement that access needed to be provided. And so because of that, you really do see many women who never even thought of participating in sports, who never thought that that was open to them. And then you see women like this who dedicate their entire lives to mastering something where they're not particularly welcome. In this transitional era, we see a little bit more of this kind of schizophrenic back and forth as people start to comprehend that this law is going to change things significantly. So Title IX was not fully implemented, but it was very present in the news. People were debating it, people were bracing for it, or embracing it, depending on how you interpreted the law. And as far as the proactive approach that some schools took, some of them immediately hired counsel and decided to challenge the law and refuse to implement particularly any changes that might impact football programs or other programs that were lucrative for them. And some were ready to embrace the change and decided, hey, if the change is coming, let's hire some coaches. Let's open up some programs for girls and we'll get them signed up. For me, looking at this period historically, I think one of the best ways to measure how the general public was thinking about these changes is to look at Sports Illustrated. Because again, this is one of the largest magazines in the country that is focused on sports and that really had a largely but not exclusively male readership, because again, sports were really aimed at men at the time. So we see some differences in the early 70s between articles that focused on non-traditional sports like football and hockey and how they treated women attempting to play these games, versus coverage of women doing more traditional sports, golf, tennis, gymnastics. I have some examples. The first one is from June 29th, 1970. In their scorecard section, they discuss a stunt threatened by Maria Hardman of the British Women's Amateur Athletic Association. So we're talking about track and field. She wanted to check women who were competing in the competition for padded bras because she claims that they allegedly might make a difference in close finishes in races. So Sports Illustrated often did not cover women in sports that was in any way balanced or fair, right? Women were often the butt of the joke. And even though these are pretty egregious examples, they are kind of funny because that is the presence. A little bit later, the following year in August, this had a photo as well that I'll show you in a moment. But it has this blurb that really highlights the unchecked sexism. And I'm assuming an attempt to be cute. It says, "See the pretty waitresses. See how they run. All this leggy activity goes on at the Charlestown Turf Club, where the dining room waitresses break from the starting gate and jog 4.5 furlongs every day except when there's a heavy racing schedule, in which case they're preempted by the horses." So it's a horse racing track. "The idea," said waitress Cindy Ham, "is to lose weight. The other day after running, I went up from 108.5 to 111.5 pounds. So the story goes on. There's nothing like a success story in full irony. The leggy waitresses then running to lose weight, but gaining it in the process, really creates a strong sexist tone. They're not respected as female athletes, nor are they even portrayed as legitimate exercise participants. Primarily, they're just pretty waitresses doing something silly. And this was not a one-off. There was a follow-up article on these leggy waitresses in September. So it refers back to them in the run, and this one adds that, and I quote, "The club staged the first annual $1,500 added hot pants handicap before the regular program," meaning horse races, referring to the women's performance as notable for the thoroughbred records that they brought to the table. So now they're the same as horses. Now we're referring to women in the same light. Some articles, in turn, were not quite so bad. They offer examples of girls trying out for the football team. She only made it one day, though, because it was really tough. Or another girl who was playing hockey, and she really liked it, and she wanted to pursue it. In those instances, they're always portrayed as unique and one-of-a-kind situations, or otherwise as quaint. An interesting aside to keep in mind as well is that this is during the Cold War. So in the United States and in the Western world, women's participation in sports is situated within the women's rights movement, within the kind of the after effects of the civil rights movement. There's a lot of protest going on in the West in the early 70s, mostly related to social and civic rights. Behind the Iron Curtain, sports were developing very differently. After the Soviets embraced this drive to use the Olympics, for instance, as a measure of the success of communism, we really start to see training athletes at all costs. And so there was a very notable disparity between the two countries in the ways that women were incorporated into sports and the ways that their bodies actually changed because of it. So I have one example that I'll share with you, but it does relate to the widespread use of performance-enhancing drugs in the Iron Curtain that was not as prevalent here, particularly for women at the time. So here's the photo of that Charlestown horse track and these waitresses taking their run. So you can see they're leaving the gates where the horses would run. But I will say Sports Illustrated was not all bad. They did publish this letter to the editor around the same time. And so this woman said, "Sirs," because of course all the editors are men, "how long are you going to permit gratuitous insults to women in your magazine? I refer to the caption with the photograph of women at Wimbledon that says, 'The strawberries are ripe, the girls are riper.' Would you dare say," and at this time, keep in mind, it's the 70s, "the Negroes are funnier, or the Italians are louder just because they appear to be exactly what they are? Stop it. We women do not like it, and we will not stand for it, and we are not girls." So, some balance. Again, this is the transitional era. Sports Illustrated is trying to find its footing with all of these changes that are pending. So I wanted to talk a little bit about just this other side of the curtain here. This is Heidi Kliege. She was an East German athlete in the 70s and 80s. And at 14, she was admitted to the Kinder- und Jugendsportschule of SC Dynamo in Berlin. So these sports schools were funded by the Stasi, who was basically the internal police of East Germany. And so these children then were not going to a regular public school anymore. They are kind of like you see in some countries today even. This is a school where they are going to be trained as an athlete and learn academics secondarily. So apart from standard subjects like math and languages, her focus was weightlifting, discus throwing, and shot put. She did this every day to train her body. But her coach provided her vitamins to help build her up, blue tablets wrapped in tin foil and packed in plastic. At 21 in 1986, she won the gold medal in shot put at the European Olympic Games in Stuttgart. But as it turns out, those were male sex steroids. They were not vitamins. So her record, you can't find it on the Olympic list anymore. It was removed in 2012 because of the drugging. They were the notorious oral turinabol, and every tablet contained 5 milligrams of testosterone. Heidi had taken them daily since she was 16, sometimes 5 times a day. So we now know that her testosterone levels were 37 times that of an average woman at the time. And after this, she had years of depression, uncertainty, suicidal tendencies. This really messes with your brain and also your body physiology. So in 1997, Heidi decided to have a sex change, and Heidi is now Andreas. She is not the only one from the Soviet sphere who had this happen to her because of the overwhelming use of these hormonal drugs to increase performance. So winning at all costs does have a consequence on the athletes. So in many ways, Title IX and the way that the United States was approaching equity is a fresh perspective from what was happening elsewhere at the time. But of course, we'll talk a little bit about the after. I'm using examples from around the globe really to just highlight the ways that American culture and the ways that Americans approach a lot of these things, particularly with sports, does have wide traction. It's not just professional or international sports though. So here's the actual amendment as written in 1972. No person in the United States shall, on the basis of sex, be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any educational program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. It seems very straightforward, but again, this has been litigated extensively. And this image you see here is actually an ad for Skins athletic gear, but it really highlights well this unlevel playing field bit. So this is the educational piece of Title IX. So in the purple are males, the yellow is female, and then we're comparing educational attainments. This has nothing to do with sports from 2010 to 2022. So you can actually see that females pretty much across the board already by 2010 had achieved more than parity with men in education. And the educational attainment, the ultimate degrees that people are receiving, the small columns at the very end here is master's or higher levels, so kind of the ultimate terminal degrees. Women have even continued to increase that gap in favor of females since Title IX has been enacted. Whereas before Title IX, many women were denied access to majors in the hard sciences, medical schools, law schools. So that has been a roaring success. But when it comes to sports, there's a number of ways we can slice these numbers, but we do see consistent increases in participation for boys and girls over the last 50 years. Between 2014 and 2019, boys' opportunities increased by about 7,000 in just the flat number of opportunities available, whereas girls increased more than 135,000. So if boys started here and girls started at the floor, girls are catching up faster than the boys are increasing their opportunities. So we are minimizing that gap in programs and access. That represents over the last 50 years more than 1,000% increase in participation for girls in sports. But by 2018-2019 school year, 3.4 million girls participated in high school sports, whereas 4.5 million boys participate in high school sports. The context is that if we look at the numbers of boys participating in sports in 1971, the girls have still not reached that number 50 years later, the actual number. So even though there is a lot of movement in that equity direction, we have not achieved it. The actual number of boys in 1971 was 3,666,917. So that 3.4 million is still below that actual number. In colleges, at the NCAA level, we see similar trends. Men's and women's participation in college have increased every year since Title IX. In 2019-2020 school year, a record number of both male and female participants were playing sports. Again though, over the last quarter century, men's opportunities in championship sports have grown at a faster rate than women's. And the overall undergraduate enrollment in NCAA division schools is 45% men, 55% women. But it's about 11% fewer women in undergraduate institutions participating in sports. So going back to that comment about, well, if women don't know that they're able to do these things, they won't do it. That's still true to some extent. If you haven't developed the skills and started a sport when you're younger, by the time you hit college, the ship has sailed. You're not going to be playing these sports at that point in time. So just to look at some of the remaining disparities to close, there are still disparities in training facilities and athletic budgets. as well as in uniforms and the standards that women are held to versus men in sports. Access to the breadth of sporting opportunities is still limited because there just don't tend to be as many teams available or as many options available for girls, although it's getting better. And then sometimes that societal, familial support system isn't present, and so that does make it harder for people to even know that access is available. So these two examples here are both from 2021. You can see many of you may have seen these because they went viral. But here is the women's weight room from the NCAA Women's Basketball Championship. This is one stand of hand weights and a table with some mats. This was the entire facility provided for these women's teams to practice and prepare for their competition. At the same time, in the same area, this was the men's training facility. And so one of these basketball players snapped these photos and it went viral because the world was shocked and appalled that this is the disparity in 2021 at the highest level of NCAA competition. Also in 2021, talking about uniforms and appearance, this is the European Beach Handball Championships. So you can see here, this is the standard uniform, this teeny tiny little bikini bottom that I don't think many people would be comfortable in, ever. And then these shorts here, and the happy grins on the Norwegian team's faces is after they each paid 150 euro fines to wear those shorts in the contest because it broke the decorum, the uniform rules of the European Beach Handball Organization. So they paid about $1,800 US and made a very strong political statement about what women should be able to wear to compete. These are they're still sporty, they're still active, they can still do everything they needed to do, but the uniform standard said that it must be a bikini. And these battles are still going on. That's just one of many examples I could give. So, to wrap up, these are also from Sports Illustrated, both of them. Title IX is often bandied about as this end-all piece of legislation that is finite, it is just what it is. But I'm hoping that you'll understand that it's not only more than sports, but it is very much a fluid and living piece of legislation that still impacts not just sports, but very many avenues in our lives. So whether or not you enjoy sports or an athlete, this realm really does impact our cultural values and beliefs about women's abilities beyond a simple game. And thank God we don't smoke in sports anymore. So that's all I have for you today. Thank you very much. I'm happy to answer questions.
I understand there's a documentary about the 1970